I am so excited to be able to have two amazing guests today. Cynthia Overton, who you all might recall is our very first repeat guest on the podcast. So we're super excited for that. And her co-author, Paolo Gaudiano, who is here with us for the first time. And we are going to talk about their work together and all kinds of things. So super excited for this show. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We appreciate being on the show, and I am just so happy to be back.
I know. I'm sure that if people heard your episode before, they love you. So it's exciting to have you back. So can we just jump right into your book that you co-wrote together, Meritocracy, right? This is, you can see it in their backgrounds if you're watching this on video. I read it on the Kindle, so I don't have it to hold it up for you. But it's such an important book, especially right now. Could one of you or both of you just summarize the book for listeners who haven't read it yet?
Paula, do you want to summarize? I do want to just say that this is actually grounded in Paolo's first book called Measuring Inclusion. And we really wanted to take a very close look at this word meritocracy, see it kind of tossed around with little meaning behind it, and really examine what does it mean to really have an organization that is grounded in meritocracy. And to Paolo's point, which he often mentions, there has never been a book titled just Meritocracy before. Yeah. And so we said, let's do it.
Paolo, what would you add?
Cynthia and I have been talking about this for a long time. In fact, it's thanks to her that we wrote the book, because I was not really thinking about writing another book, but she's like, we got to write another book, or you got to write a book with these additional ideas.
Yeah.
And one thing that we were very careful about is that the term meritocracy has been the subject of a lot of, I would say, tension, if you want. And it's been pitted sometimes as being the opposite of DEI. And we thought right away that there was something really wrong with that kind of characterization, because ultimately meritocracy has some flaws in the way that it's maybe currently implemented, but the fundamental ideas are not bad. But what we really wanted to do was to stay away from the controversy and really focus on very tangible aspects of it. And in fact, one of the reasons why the subtitle actually talks about talent management, and it's really about how to manage talent.
Yeah.
And that's something that we really cared about. We wanted to make sure the book would not be like so many other books about meritocracy. They use the word meritocracy in the title, but it's like the meritocracy paradox, or, the meritocracy fallacy, or the rise of meritocracy. And there are all these other titles. We really wanted to say, look, how can we define it in a way that makes it measurable and makes it linkable to the financial success of an organization and to the satisfaction of the employees. Yeah. And then toward the back of the book, we also address sort of in a final chapter some of the issues that have led to the controversy and why we think that those issues are misplaced. And then in reality, most people should believe in something reasonably close to the ideal of meritocracy, which is that, people should be able to be hired, rewarded, promoted based on their skills and their contributions, not on what they look like, not on their gender, not on their social connections, not on who's their daddy. So that was essentially trying very hard to make it a very practical book.
Yeah, and that was a great definition that you just gave for how you see meritocracy as well. And without getting too much into the controversy, did the idea for the book spring up when you heard so many people misusing the word and using it to manipulate the way people understand diversity, equity, and inclusion work?
Well, I would say that we've been experiencing that for a minute now. Mm-hmm. I think that in terms of people talking about it, for me, I would say that I became motivated to write the book when I saw action put with the talk in terms of all of these changes being made, specifically when it came to the dismantling of many programs that were really designed to ensure that people had fair opportunities in the workplace. So this is something that's been, of course, discussed for a minute. But when we saw the action start to happen, that's why I was like, we need to do something.
Yeah. And oh, go ahead, Paolo.
No, I was going to add one thing, which is that in my work, and I want to qualify something up front, which is that as a white male, cisgender, heterosexual man in my 60s now, with a lot of the kinds of privileges that are not often affiliated or associated with people working in DI, I see things from a somewhat unusual angle. And one thing that I had been fairly vocal about in my work on DEI was the fact that even within DEI, some of the terminology is not defined particularly clearly. And I believe that that's actually been a problem. I'd spoken
Yeah.
about and written about the fact that the term inclusion and the term equity are both terms that are defined in ways that are somewhat vague, not measurable, and unfortunately defined in ways that can sometimes upset other people. And we can get into that and why that means. And so to me, when the whole DI versus MEI or merit, excellence, intelligence, whatever that was, or meritocracy came about, one of my first questions was, well, let's find out exactly how is meritocracy defined? And
Yeah.
that's when we realized that it's like, wait a second, nobody's ever really defined it very clearly, and nobody has ever defined it in a way that makes it measurable. And so to me, it was that additional interest of the fact that we tend to be a little bit at times careless with our language. We say words
Mhm.
without defining them clearly. And that
Mhm.
unfortunately allows other people to fill in the blanks in ways that is convenient to them. And I think that's exactly what happened with the attack on DEI is that people started to use terms like woke in a negative way. And they
Yeah.
started to define DEI as something negative. And so we are on a mission. And I think that Cynthia and I have had many, many, many discussions, and we had written other things before, not full books, but shorter things that revolved around the importance of the words that you choose and the backgrounds that lead you to interpret certain words in certain ways.
Right.
Yeah.
So now when people use the term meritocracy and, folks are not necessarily clear, they're just trying to make a point. We want people to say, yes, let's talk about meritocracy. And
Yeah.
it's interesting because Paulo talked about the perspective which he comes from, and I think that that's one of the things that makes this piece so unique in terms of, we both have different backgrounds. He described his background. Me, I'm a Black female in my early 20s, and so my perspective is much different than his, right? Based on our experiences.
Beautiful. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's so well put because that's certainly one of the things that people talk a lot about in terms of the field that was called DEI is now called so many other things because of all the attacks. But that idea that there haven't been clear definitions, that there haven't been clear standards, and so you can get people who are doing the work and who have clear definitions themselves and who have clear ways of measuring things themselves, but it doesn't mean that there's any consistency from one practitioner to the next or any standards. So sometimes people have really bad experiences with DEI, firms or practitioners, and then it turns them off from the whole field when in fact that's not how other people are doing this work. And so it's kind of a shame. So I love that you're trying to standardize definitions and ways of measuring because that is super important. I mean, as a social scientist myself, that idea of actually measuring some of this and using innovative methods to do it is so important. So I'm so glad you all are bringing that to the table. Can you just, if we've talked on the podcast before, we've talked about ways that politicians, especially, have been manipulating words like meritocracy or DEI. But can you just talk a little bit for if folks haven't listened to those episodes yet and are unclear, how has that word meritocracy been manipulated or co-opted in the last, I mean, let's specifically say maybe, the last year and a half or so?
I guess I'll take a first stab at it. I would say meritocracy itself, it's not so much that it's been co-opted. I would say that the terminology has been fairly consistent and it's been used. It's more that it gets thrown around carelessly.
Mm,
And I think to this day, I know I subscribe to one of these Google alerts for the word meritocracy.
mhm.
And it's kind of amazing to see the types of articles that pop up, like a lot of articles that talk about sports and sports leagues. And then I've seen
Mhm.
people talk about meritocracy by saying, oh, we cannot, like in Formula One, right? It's like, what does this have to do with meritocracy? Well, there was some manager of some team that was complaining because the Formula One body wanted to introduce a rule that would control some aspect of the cars. And it's like, well, that would destroy the meritocracy of Formula One. And I was like, this has absolutely nothing to do with meritocracy, right? So
Yeah.
people talk about meritocracy as the American dream. They talk about meritocracy as hiring the best, to which in the book we say, look, hiring the best is candidate selection. That's not meritocracy. Hiring is only a tiny portion of the relationship with people. So it's not so much that it's been co-opted, but it's that I think people have co-opted the meaning of words from DEI, especially equity, has
Hmm.
been really twisted in ways that have made it mean something different than I think was initially intended. And then they carelessly throw the word meritocracy out without ever challenging themselves the way that they challenge other words. And so it's really
Yeah.
more of a lack of definition than, people co-opting it and using it in ways that's inappropriate. At least
Yeah.
that's my take. Cynthia, I don't know what you think about
Yeah.
that.
So I agree with what Paulo said, but I would also include an and. So I do kind of see the word being co opted, in addition to everything that my colleague just said. When I hear the word meritocracy in some circles, it's kind of like there's this unspoken standard of what meritocracy is. And oftentimes that's affiliated with people who look absolutely nothing like me.
Hmm.
When people like me enter the picture, then there's all these asterisks that surface, and we have to talk about, qualifications and this, that, the other. So I agree with everything that Paulo said, but I would also extend that to, and there's this whole other conversation with surrounding the word meritocracy.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's like a code for just white, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like white men. Anyone else, there's this assumption that that couldn't have been meritocracy, that
Mm-hmm,
that
mm-hmm.
that that was unfair, whatever
Right,
happened
right.
to make
And
that
it's
happen.
interesting, Michael and I have very similar backgrounds, and it would be interesting in terms of doing an experiment to kind of see where meritocracy sits.
All
Yeah.
right, right?
Uh,
Yeah, it would be really fascinating.
Yeah, if I can expand on that a little bit, and I'm very fortunate that because of a combination of my demographics and the work that I do, I get exposed to people from, and I don't want to talk, unfortunately these days you do kind of think about them as being two different sides, right? Even though I
Mhm.
think that ultimately people have very common, very shared values, but
Yeah.
unfortunately they get represented in different ways. But what's interesting to me is that a lot of people that I really trust and whose work is phenomenal, the wonderful people, are quite skeptical about meritocracy. They talk
Mm.
about meritocracy in ways that are not entirely positive, and for very good reasons, because a lot of times meritocracy has been used as an excuse. It's like, oh
Mm.
well, this person got ahead because of meritocracy. They deserved it. They merit, getting the raise. They merit getting hired and all these things. And unfortunately, when you apply that in a way that is not systematic, that is not measured, that is not demonstrably actually not just fair, but also that it makes business sense, what ends up happening is that the people that do not enjoy those benefits start to feel very strongly about it. And I had experiences as we were writing the book. I've actually had a couple of people who felt so strongly against the word meritocracy, like they even refused to read early drafts of the book. They're like, there is
Mm.
no way meritocracy is BS, it's just a big lie, etc. What's interesting to me is that I've heard very similar, really strong negative feelings toward DEI by people that, felt that they were being done unjustly. They were, discriminated against because of DEI. And it's fascinating to me that there's a tendency for people to get all upset about things for good reason. And unfortunately, that helps to create that further polarization. And I hope that one of the things that our book will do is to say, look, forget all of that. Let's define it. Let's
Yeah.
agree on some common ideas and some common values, and let's see how we can make that work so that it works for everyone
Yeah.
and not just for the people who happen to look like me most of the time. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, the fact is that the book really is designed to empower readers, no matter where they sit.
Hmm.
And we don't want to minimize anybody's past and personal experiences, but we really do want to offer this as a tool for moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Have you found people picking it up and reading it, like thinking it was saying something different than what it says, like thinking they were reading an anti-DEI book and then
Well,
kind of surprised?
it was just released not too long ago, but I will tell you, Michael, that when I speak to people sometimes, they're very confused in terms of knowing me, knowing kind of like my outlook, knowing what I've done professionally, and then when I explain the book to them, they're like, "Oh, okay."
yeah.
Yeah. It's really brilliant framing, actually.
I'll tell you, there's another interesting point about something that you said there, which is that in the book, one of the very, very first things that we say is to point out that the only way to know whether your organization is actually meritocratic is to measure two things. You need to measure that the outcomes, whether or not the outcomes depend on factors that should be relevant, but you also need to measure whether or not the opportunities to access things that make you succeed in an organization are also equal and do not depend on those irrelevant things. And so we talk about the idea of what we call inclusive meritocracy. As Cynthia mentioned, a lot of this work is essentially almost like a sequel to my first book on measuring inclusion. And the way that I defined inclusion, which was also unusual, I defined inclusion in terms of experiences in the workplace and whether or not organizations ensure that all employees have experiences in the workplace that enable them to succeed. And so there is that symmetry. And so we introduced this idea of inclusive meritocracy. And so initially we thought, well, maybe we should title the book Inclusive Meritocracy. But then we realized that we would piss off everyone because the people that don't like DI would not like the term inclusive, and the people that don't like meritocracy would not like. So we decided, you know what? Nobody's ever used the title meritocracy. Let's stick with that one and hope that people will be willing to go beyond the title, even if they're a little skeptical about it. And that those people that are very skeptical about inclusion will read the book and go like, oh, this is not such a bad idea.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the thing about polarizing terms like DEI or meritocracy is it makes it seem like there are these huge splits, and yet when you really look at what we're talking about, the specifics of it, there's so much more agreement there among people than you would expect. What do you think most people don't understand about meritocracy, just in simple, plain language? Like, what do people not understand?
For me, I think it's really the important role of systems that need to be in place in order to have an environment, a meritocratic environment. One of the things that we talk about is structural enablers. And these are kind of like factors within organizations that can contribute to either people having opportunities or blocking opportunities. And that's one of the things that I think is so special about this book, is that it really focuses on systems, and systems really being able to serve as guardrails for individual behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. Good. What do you think, Paolo? What do people not understand?
Well, so I completely agree with Cynthia. And from a practical perspective, I agree that's the most important part of what we do in the book, is to take this kind of systems perspective. I was surprised, and I've already kind of mentioned this, by how willingly people throw the word around, especially as a counterpoint to DEI, without really having any clue of what it actually means and how it's defined. It's almost like there's this tacit acknowledgement that, oh, when we say this word, we all agree that this is what it means. But if you put 10 people in a room and you ask them to define meritocracy, you would probably get 10 different definitions.
Yeah.
Which, as I said, interestingly is, and we'll come back to this later, but when you ask 10 people to define the word inclusion or equity, you're going to get similarly 10 different kinds of definitions. And so to me, that's the biggest part, that people are not really willing to challenge that. It's like, well, it's a sacred cow. We're a meritocracy. America is, holding up the American dream is about, the best people win, and, we hire the best and all these things. So that's the thing that really amazed me the most about the lack of general willingness to explore what it means and of course, how you'd measure it.
Yeah, gosh. It's fascinating. I want to get back to this idea of systems, though, and organizational biases, because those I think are hard for people to understand. Can you say more about how you approach this idea of like systems versus individual behavior or individual interactions or individual ways of thinking, organizational bias versus individual bias?
This is something actually that I realized a long time ago, which is that a lot of the focus, and this has actually been true of DI as well, has been on individuals. It's been on, oh, if only people did not have biases, if only we made everybody conscious of the biases that they have, if only they stopped being, racist or discriminating against women or the world would be a better place. And one of the things that I realized early on was that this was actually a fallacy in two ways. One of them is because it's impossible to get rid of people's biases.
Right.
But the second one is because it's not the individual biases that really cause problems. And there was actually something that we talk about in the book, which is which I think is a perfect example. There was a lawsuit against Tesla, one of the Tesla factories in Fremont in California. This was several years ago, and there were some black employees that brought a lawsuit and won, got a lot of money from Tesla because of the fact that they showed there was evidence that their manager would call them the N-word. People would leave, racist and horrible graffiti on walls and basically insult them openly. What was interesting about that was that there was an interview of one of the senior executives in that particular factory who said, well, in this factory alone, we have more than 10,000 employees. Certainly we cannot be held accountable for that. And to me, that was a classical example of a failure to understand that the problem is not that people are biased or bigoted or racist. The problem is that if you do not have processes, policies, and ways to control those kinds of behaviors and to react as an organization so that those individual biases cannot harm people, then you as an organization are failing. So the idea of organizational biases is that it's for example, the lack of a policy that says that if you are found to be using racist language with your employees, you're going to get fired. Or if you are holding meetings and you're constantly forgetting to invite people, we're going to measure you on that, and your salary is going to depend on that as a manager, right? And so we pinpoint in the book these ideas of different ways that organizations allow individual biases to impact large numbers of people, sometimes through openly discriminatory practices. Like, for example, we only hire students from Ivy League schools. Well, that's clearly going to have a dramatic impact on the kind of people that you're going to hire. Or, oh, we have all hands team meetings at 8 o'clock in the morning. Well, that's a different kind of bias because you're not saying we're discriminating against women, but because women do a disproportionate amount of caretaking for their children, it's going to be very inconvenient, more so for women than for men. And so those are the kinds of things that we highlight in the book. And we talk about these 4 kinds of organizational biases, how to spot them, how to recognize them, and how they have a much more profound impact in potentially in creating problems for people. And if you fix them, then you can actually make things much better for a lot of people.
Oh my gosh.
And,
So true. Yeah.
yeah, and I would just like to add to that in terms of one of the things that I, said before that's so special about this book is that we do really focus on organizational biases. But I also want to still understand the importance of support when it comes to recognizing individual and personal biases. Everybody has bias. I have bias. I would say that still those programs that are in place that help people understand and check their biases better position them to operate successfully within a system that is designed to, cut out these organizational biases. So I would not say we don't need to focus at all on the personal biases. I would say that they go hand in hand.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, I love that you're focusing on those different levels. The example I often use, which is so easy for people to understand, is talking about the orchestra bias study, where you had these orchestras that were almost all men because people had this bias that men were going to play better. And then when you put up a screen so you couldn't see the person, all of a sudden you get more women hired. And so as a solution, you could work with all the people doing the hiring for the orchestra and try to get them to reduce their biases. But exactly like you were saying, Paolo, it's not possible. They're really deep-seated. And also, it's a lot of work in every decision, in every moment, to keep that in mind. So instead, let's just have a policy of a screen there, and then we don't have to think about it. We don't have to worry about it.
And if I'm not mistaken, I could be remembering this incorrectly, but I think that it was the screen, but then they had to do something about the shoes too.
Yeah, you had to take off the high heel shoes too, because you could still hear the people walking in who had high heels differently. So you just had to get rid of all that. And that's brilliant.
If I can build a moment on something that Cynthia said about unconscious bias training, that has not worked out very well. And there is actually a lot of research that shows that unconscious bias training rarely works, and in most cases actually backfires. One of the reasons, as Cynthia pointed out, is because you need to do it in the context of a system that can actually improve matters. But it also pinpoints sort of the symmetrical problem to the Tesla VP that says that, oh, if only all these people, which is that when you're asked to do one of the unconscious bias trainings, a lot of it pins the blame on you. So a lot of people hate it because they feel like, oh, you're blaming me for being a bad person. You're telling me that I'm racist and sexist and this is
Yeah.
and that is
Mhm.
and that. So it's the combination of all those things. Whereas we have done, and when I say we, my organizational area have done training sessions that are entirely about these organizational biases. And one thing that people love about it is that they completely get rid of that. They get rid of that sense of guilt without making you feel like, oh, it's okay to be biased. It's like, yes, you can be biased, but your organization should be responsible to ensure that your biases do not inadvertently hurt people. And by the way, if you're aware of these biases and if you're aware of where your organization may allow these biases to impact people, it's going to make your life easier because your team will be happier. They
Yeah.
will be performing better. And if you're a manager, what's better than knowing that we're actually going to help make your team more successful? So it's a very, and I really love, this is something that Cynthia, you've said earlier, and I have to credit you for being really, really strong and vocal about this, which is that we're all about looking forward. This is not about looking back and saying what hasn't worked. It's about how can we make things work better? How can
Yeah.
we move forward, look to a future in which organizations are actually not just treating their employees more fairly, but making more money in doing so? Because that's really one of the things that we think that a lot of leaders are concerned about is,
Yeah.
ultimately, how do we make more money?
People throw around this idea of the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion a lot, that it's not just the right thing to do, it actually helps you make more money. And that's been around for a long time. And you all in the book are really clear about that, even giving like some numbers. At one point you say, using this calculator, we've shown that under reasonable assumptions, a typical organization may be invisibly losing 20% or more of its net profits because of differences in satisfaction levels. So can you talk to us about that? How are you convincing people differently about the business case?
Should I take this one, Cynthia?
Go for it. This is your
Yeah,
jam, so go
this has
for it.
been my jam. I have, as I mentioned earlier, I've sometimes been openly critical, trying to be constructively critical about certain things that I've seen in the field of DEI that I felt were not necessarily as productive as they could have been. And one of them was the business case. The business case that has been voiced over time has been based on these large scale correlations. Oh, when you look at, 1,000 companies, there is a slight positive correlation between the level of diversity of the leadership and their EBITDA or whatever, right? And I have a couple of problems with that one. One of them is that a correlation is not causation, right? So that's kind of an old saying that basically means just because two things are happening together, it does not mean that one is causing the other. And I have this it's a bit of a harsh joke, but I tell people, imagine that somebody did a study in which they compared tooth color and the probability of having lung cancer. And lo and behold, you find that people that have yellower teeth are more likely to there's a correlation between how yellow your teeth are and your
Yeah.
probability of lung cancer. And so you say, oh, I know how to fix it. I'm going to sell you tooth whitener. That's going to cure your cancer, your lung cancer. Sadly, when we use correlation to claim the business case for DI, that's exactly what we're doing. And so one of the things that we do in our book that I think is dramatically different is to recognize that a leader does not need high level correlations. They need to know what is going to happen in my company. How am I going to make more money? And we change the conversation in two ways. One of them is because we show them literally exactly what is happening in their company and how to measure that. But secondly, is because instead of saying, oh, make the company more fair and you will make more money, and it's not exactly clear how that will happen. Oh, it's through greater innovation and greater sales. But those are things that are very, very difficult to prove because they're kind of detached, right? You have to wait a long time and you have to look for other variables. We go at it backwards. We say, we can prove to you that you're losing money today. It's kind of like those companies that come to you and say, hey, let us look through your bills and see if you're overpaying for some of your subscriptions.
Yeah.
And that's basically what we do. It's like, we believe that there are areas in your organization where some people are essentially suffering. They're unable to succeed for reasons that are just not meaningful. And so we can spot those things, we can fix them for you, and we can tell you how much money you're losing today,
Yeah.
how to fix what problems you have, and how much money you will save by fixing that. So it completely flips the equation, both in terms of the fact that we're focusing on the individual company and in the terms of saving money rather than promising future earnings through
Yeah.
some unclear and indirect mechanisms.
And so you actually, I mean, you can actually do that. You can look at their books and you can show them, you can calculate how much they're actually losing because of that.
Yes. And I'll
That,
tell you, so we've developed this very simple a calculator. It superficially looks very simple, but some of the logic behind it is not as obvious as it may be. That will take, and it's available on the Alera website for free. There is a free version. We have a more advanced kind of commercial version, but you can basically put in how many employees you have, what revenues you make, what are your demographic groups, and what are the respective levels of satisfaction. And you can use any data. You can do whether you have engagement surveys or pulse surveys or ENPS or satisfaction, whatever you have. You plug in the numbers and it will give you a rough estimate of how much money your company is likely to be losing. And I had a very bizarre, well, actually, I shouldn't say bizarre. I have a wonderful experience. About a month ago, I was at a conference and there was a leader, a HR leader of a major technology organization who made a comment about the fact that in her company, they decided to change the angle and they essentially undertook a project that sounded like it was a fairly intense project where they estimated losing a very significant amount of money annually just because of lower retention rates due to satisfaction. And I sat down with this woman and with my calculator. This was the project. It took them like months and large teams to do it. And I sat down and I plugged the numbers into my calculator, just the top line numbers. And the estimate that the calculator gave was within 5% of their estimate.
wow.
And this one was blown away. It's like, how did you do that? It's like, it seemed like magic. But it turns out that, again, if you think about it from a systems perspective, and especially how do you link what happens at the individual level with what happens at the systems level, which is a fairly important theme in the book, it turns out that it's not that difficult to reason your way through it. So instead of just staying at the abstract level, you really think about, well, what happens when you have a woman who is less satisfied than a man? Well, when a woman is less satisfied than a man, or a black person is less satisfied than a white person, that person will produce less, and that person is more likely to leave the company. And you can easily attach numbers to both of those, and then sort of extrapolate to the whole organization, and you'd be surprised how accurately you can make predictions even based on things like that. You don't have to worry about like, well, but this is what happens to these people and this is what happens to that people and that made them feel bad and this made them feel unfair and we're doing, it's like, look, it's pretty simple math, right? I mean, fundamentally, regardless of why a particular person is less satisfied, if you're causing the person to be less satisfied for reasons that are not related to their skills and what they contribute to your company, you're throwing money away.
Right.
And it's a pretty beautiful argument or reasoning. And again, people don't disagree with that at all. They're like, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And so I think that it's easy to kind of think about this through the lens of the employer to the folks who really understand how the business works in terms of making money. And I would just want to emphasize the importance of kind of understanding this approach when it comes to employees in terms of really understanding what motivates organizations. Oftentimes, if it's for profit, it would be money. And I think that this isn't just a good book for, executive leaders, but also folks who are involved in employee resource groups, people who are leading employee resource groups to really strengthen the tie between their contributions to the organization and what organizational leaders are particularly interested in.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, there's so many things about that are so important. Like, one, I think there's this general impression of people who work in this field that it's very loosey-goosey. It's just like people are getting offended and people are and there's no real systematic method to figuring this out. And I think there are a lot of people that hear it's good for business but don't really buy it. So I love the focus on numbers. And then, like you were saying, and I'm sure lots of folks do this slightly differently, but when you dig into the assessments that you do about satisfaction, you also get this fine grain, well, why are people feeling dissatisfied? And that gives you a roadmap to actually making changes in the organization so that people feel more satisfied, because it's not just amorphous dissatisfaction. It's like, I feel bad because my manager does this, or like, I feel bad because, I can't get in at 8 in the morning for a meeting, or I feel bad for lots of other things, right? You talk about this a lot in the book. What should organizations do? How can they start to do this? But how would you explain it in a nutshell? Like, what if someone's listening and they're thinking, "Oh my gosh, I don't want to lose, I don't want to lose all this money. I don't want my people to be dissatisfied. What can I do?" Well, how do you
Well,
talk to them?
yeah, the first thing that I would say to do is take a look at your systems. Take a look at how your employees are understanding your systems. Take a look at how these systems are set up. Are they creating opportunities? Are they creating barriers to folks? And one of the ways to do that is to ask your employees and, listen and make adjustments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What would you add, Paolo?
We do a range of assessments. The most important one is what we call our inclusion assessment, which is where we really dig into understanding not just the fact that people are less satisfied or more satisfied, but what is happening that is causing them to be more or less satisfied, which gives you the roadmap that you need. We have a chapter, so we talk about what we call the meritocracy checkup, which is how you would, within your organization, identify what we call these structural enablers that Cynthia mentioned, and the organizational biases, how you can essentially do a self-audit, extract the knowledge of your managers to figure out where there might be some potential places where biases are inadvertently impacting people negatively. And then we also talk about the inclusion assessment, which was described in much more detail in my earlier book. But even there, we then put it all together and we talk about this idea that we call it the inclusive meritocracy playbook. And we literally give you sort of 5 stages. And for each of them, we say, well, here's how you do stage 1. Here's how you do stage 2. You always start by educating people, especially your leaders. Because before you undertake any of these projects, we think that it's important to get buy-in from the entire company, especially from the leadership. And so we talk about how can you do that, using the language that is non-controversial, using the focus on the fact that you're losing money and things of that sort. Then we talk about how you can do your meritocracy checkup, and we talk about how you can do your inclusion assessment and how you can use the calculator to estimate the losses that you're facing. And so we try to give a fairly detailed guide.
Love it. You mentioned something in passing that I think people might be interested in. This was a while back when you were talking about, and this is in the book too, how that idea of finding the best candidate for a job opening is kind of a flawed way of thinking about things. Could one of you elaborate on that? Because I hear that all the time. People say, we're just trying to find the best candidate.
Right. And I think that a lot of times people don't even know what that means. I mean, I think at the end of the day, people want to be able to hire somebody who's going to be able to kind of take it and run with it. I think that a lot of times, we'll hear or see job announcements that say, comfortable with ambiguity. And I think that taking an initial investment in terms of really understanding what the needs are and really understanding how to identify a person that can meet those needs, and understanding that there's not going to be just one perfect person. Different people bring different things to the table. And I think that one of the challenges is that a lot of times folks who are looking to hire folks, they just want something done and are not really willing to put in the work to make it happen in terms of finding somebody who would be able to fulfill a role.
Yeah.
And I would expand on that in 2 ways. I mean, plus one on everything that Cynthia said. I'm going to make slightly more critical remarks, especially aimed at people that are more like myself. One of them is, a lot of times the decision of what makes a candidate merit to be hired over another candidate is based on subjective criteria. Oh, they went to a really top school, therefore they must be better. They went to the same school that I went to, or they were introduced by a friend of mine, therefore they must be better. But on a more macroscopic scale, ultimately, the one thing also that we talk about in the book is that the idea that meritocracy is focused on hiring is a little bit silly, because if you think about it, if you're lucky and you made your choices properly, the hiring aspect will be a tiny fraction of the life that this person will spend in your organization. And
Mm-hmm.
so focusing so much on who you hire without really understanding how that's going to, there's this assumption that if you hire the best, they're going to be the best throughout their tenure in your company, which is absolutely proven not to be the case. I mean, there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of evidence of people that with the most promising futures that were hired and ended up being a flop, and conversely, people that were hired thinking, yeah, they're not going to be very good, who rose to be superstars. In fact, I would argue that yes, there is an element of hiring that can be described as being meritocratic, but
Mm-hmm.
really a meritocracy as an organization should be much more concerned about what happens once you've hired a person in your
Yeah.
company.
Yeah.
Right. Right. Because a lot of times it's really an issue of you bring somebody in and their success depends on whether or not they can navigate the system that is in
Yeah.
place. And there are
Yeah.
some people who might be good at navigating systems. There are some people who can kind of take advantage of there's all types of, just like me bias and all types of
Mm-hmm.
factors that can make it easier for some people and difficult for others.
Yeah.
And so that kind of goes back to this whole idea of making sure that you have systems in place that allows opportunity for everybody to
Yeah.
be successful.
Yeah. Yeah. I love how you brought in that out. I mean, that's one of the manipulations that happened with that term meritocracy, right? Is focusing the whole conversation about DEI on hiring, right? I want to ask too, this has come up once or twice, the idea of equity. Like you talk about equity and how that's kind of been misunderstood or misused. Can you just talk us through how you think about equity and meritocracy together? Can you tease apart kind of what's similar, what's different? What are people getting wrong about that?
Well, as Paolo always likes to point out, we really want to focus on inputs. We're not looking for the same outcomes. We're looking for the same opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, kind of going back to this whole idea of systems being in place designed for everybody to succeed.
Mm-hmm.
There's this story, I know, Cynthia, I hope you will tolerate me telling a bit about the race analogy, right? There's a story that we talk about in the book that has fascinated me, which is I've heard people talk about in support of DI, especially in support of affirmative action, the idea of using an analogy with a foot race. Imagine there is a race in a stadium, a 10K race, and the racers begin, and after they round the first corner, they realize that there were obstacles left on some of the tracks, but not on all the tracks.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people that had obstacles on their tracks, they fall behind. The judges, seeing this, remove the obstacles before they go around again, but then they say, well, this is not fair. And so let's stop all the racers, allow the ones in the back to catch up, and then let's let the race continue. And that has been used, variants of that have been used to
Mm-hmm.
support the idea of affirmative action and not just equal opportunity. I was once part of a debate between myself and another professor from a university I was the pro DI, he was the anti DI, and he used an
Mm-hmm.
analogy where he said, imagine you're watching a foot race in a stadium, and the gun goes off and the racers start running, and the faster racers get ahead, and the judges stop them to allow the slower racers to catch up so that everybody can finish at the same time. This is what DI wants. DI wants equality of outcomes.
Mm.
Now, if you read the DI literature on equity, DI asks for equality of outcomes. And there's this whole debate between equity versus equality and the fact that
Yeah.
we don't just want equality, we want equity. By using that definition, unfortunately, we in DI have shot ourselves in the foot because we basically go exactly counter to what all the meritocracy people would say, which is that no, outcomes should not be equal. You don't want everybody to get a gold medal at the end. You want to know who's faster. The problem that we point out in the book is that both of those analogies are wrong because they assume that you've watched the race from the beginning. They make different assumptions. One group assumes that the reason why some racers are behind is because they were not given the same opportunity. The other group assumes that the other racers are ahead because they were better. Neither of
Mm.
them actually knows, and neither of them makes that assumption stated clearly. They just assume, because a more correct analogy is I walked into a stadium, I see we're in the middle of a race, I see that some runners are in front, some are behind, but I don't know why. And I don't know why the
Mm.
judges stopped them. Maybe some of the
Mm.
racers behind were actually about to lap the racers in front. Who knows? And what's going to happen in the
Mm.
next race? And so equity, unfortunately, has been misrepresented, and you're using a term that means something different in finance. You use it in a way that upsets people because it's saying, yes, we want equal outcomes when opportunities and skills are the same. But if you don't say that, people can reasonably interpret that to mean, oh, you want everybody to get a gold medal at the end, regardless of whether they deserved it or not.
Well, and I just kind of want to add one thing to that, and that's pointing out the data that we see in terms of pay disparities and promotion rates and all that when it comes to women, when it comes to people of color, when it comes to other people who are historically overlooked. And I do think that one of the challenges that we have is that, we have these outcomes that are similar, right? But then the rewards are quite different. And I think that that's just something that I had to speak up and mention because that is very problematic. So we're when we talk about, when we're having these conversations, we're not talking about, rewards should not should be different.
If you read my first book, I say inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, equity is what you want. But I'm very careful that I define equity to say, when you look at things like promotions and payments, then you should measure them and make sure that there are no unexpected differences based on things that should be relevant. That exact definition is how we define merit in the second book, right? So there was this little sleight of hand where I realized that the word equity was very loaded and seen very negatively, and that the word merit was loosely meaning the same thing, but not really defined properly. So in my mind, and I shouldn't say not just in my mind, but in the language that evolved in the first book, equity and merit can mean exactly the same thing. But unless you define them quantifiably and consistently, then they become subject to what people think about each of those terms.
Right. And I just wanted to kind of go back to the discussion on meritocracy. What does it mean? What does it mean? We're really talking about one's personal characteristics, in terms of, what they look like, their social connections. None of these factors should determine whether or not somebody is successful.
Yeah, gosh, this is fascinating. I feel like we could talk forever about this because I really am so curious. I often bring it up with like the orchestra example, even that we talked about. Like if we're the New York Philharmonic, there are certain things that we can do, like, putting up a screen so that people aren't having these differential outcomes based on their characteristics. But that doesn't do anything for the inequities in society in terms of, do you have $250,000 to invest to be able to be good at music to get to the point where you could even audition for something like that? Or if people are investing that money more in men because they've got bias about who's going to succeed in music. So there are all sorts of issues that have nothing to do with the organization itself, and where people show up there. So we could go on and on about that, but we'll save that for a part two. What are you finding these days when you work with people and organizations? All the existential sort of anxiety people are having over their jobs and AI and the economy and the political events in the world. Like, what are you finding?
Yeah, I have found that people are still very interested in creating workplaces where folks want to show up and do a good job. I think that people feel a little limited in terms of, some of the language that they can use. And so I think that's one of the things that's so appealing about our book, because it really addresses a common problem that practically everybody has, and that's that they want to be able to create environments that allow employees to advance mission, and that's what meritocracy is all about.
Yeah, love it. Where should people go if they want to? I mean, certainly they can and should get the book and read it. Where can they go to connect more with both of you and to learn more about your writings?
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. I would also say go to cynthiaoverton.com. Paulo has created an amazing website for the book. If you're really interested in how to implement, the strategies discussed in the book, Illyria has a whole setup that's waiting and ready for large, medium, and small size organizations to engage.
And
Excellent.
and we should probably mention, so the website, thank you for the plug, it was really kind of a team effort, but the website is meritocracybook.com, all one word, meritocracybook.com. We even gave it a little chatbot, a little AI chatbot that has knowledge of some of the content of the book that can answer questions. And from there, you can also find links to, well, you can contact us. You can find links to our various profiles and the company Aleria that Cynthia and I both have mentioned.
Beautiful, beautiful. Now, just one last thing. Often, if people want to do something after hearing this, if they're inspired to follow up, besides reading the book, would you assign them any homework assignments, like something they can think about or talk about with their teams or journal about or watch or read besides the book?
Well, I'm going to just give a thought just in terms of from the regular employee perspective. And I would
Yeah.
say that for those who are engaged in employee resource groups, to really kind of think about how to socialize some of these ideas with executive leadership in terms of expressing the need for why transparency around systems and strengthened systems are so important for folks, are so important for the work. And I would also encourage anybody who is job hunting, if there is room for negotiation. I know that there is, it's a challenging market now, but if there is room for negotiation, to really, ask the tough questions in terms of how things are done within organizations when it comes to evaluation, when it comes to assigning opportunities, when it comes to understanding how upward professional mobility works.
Yeah.
So, ask those tough questions if there's room to do that.
Good. Anything you would add to homework assignments, Paolo?
The one thing that I would encourage people to do is that if you go to the book page, meritocracybook.com, there is a way even if you've not purchased the book, you're lost. But even if you've not purchased it, you can scroll to the bottom, and by entering your email address, it gives you access to the book's companion page. And I point that out because the companion page has a couple of interactive activities, and one of them actually has a link to the calculator that we mentioned.
Yeah.
I think it's an eye-opening experience to load the calculator with data from your company, or you can make it fake data, whatever you want to. Play with the calculator, ask that one has its own chatbot that has knowledge about how the calculator works. It also, in the companion page, the companion pages for the book, there's also a page that has this matrix of, we talked about the structural enablers and the organizational biases, and it kind of explains a little bit and gives an example of each of them. I would encourage people to go play with those capabilities. They make a little bit more sense if you've read the book, but even if you've not read the book, you'll get a pretty good idea of the kinds of ways that you can start thinking about these issues differently.
Yeah.
Let's kind of get beyond the emotional, ideological, political aspect of it, not to take away from the value of any of those things, but let's ultimately recognize that if we want to move forward, we should put those things aside and use them as motivation to do something practical that actually makes us better, makes the world better.
Yeah.
Yeah. Love it. Love it. I can't thank you both enough for being here. The focus on systems and measurements and actual meritocracy, it's just bringing so much value to people who listen to the podcast. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, Michael.
All right.
Thank you.
Take care.